Well, good afternoon, everyone. It really is a great honor and privilege to be asked by American University's Key Executive Development Program to host one of their FEDTalks in 2021. But it is also humbling for me to be with Dr. Susan Jenkins, a colleague who's a remarkable leader, evaluator, and professor. For our session today, we are going to talk or take a more conversational approach, which we hope inspires dialogue with you and amongst yourselves. So there, as we start this, and as you've, for any of you who've participated in previous Fed Talks, you know that there are so many areas of knowledge, skills, and abilities that federal leaders must have or have themselves or with their teams to be successful. Whether that's leading change, leading people, emotional and social intelligence, budget and performance, information, finance, procurement, IT. Well, today, what we're talking about is one that we think is often overlooked and sometimes even diminished. Yet it is really foundational for all of the other competencies leaders must have. And that is an understanding of evidence, evaluation, and equity. And so for today's discussion, what we're going to be covering is we'll be doing little introductions for all of us. We're going to talk about the role of evidence in program development, management, and sunsetting of programs. We're going to do a quick review of recent federal requirements in these areas. But we'd like to really talk with you about why should you care about any of this? What do we mean? So some really critical definitions that affect evidence, evaluation, and equity, pitfalls to avoid, and then we want to give you some tips and tricks for success. And we'll finish up with, again, kind of talking through why should you care about this? So to help us tailor the conversation and maybe the stories that we bring to bear, we'd really like to find out who's in the audience. And so we'd like to go ahead and launch a poll that you should see on your screen. If you don't see it on your screen or don't have the ability to see it on your screen, go ahead and put your answer in the chat. And so we have several folks jumping in. Great. Well, it looks like the vast majority of folks here with us are federal staff or federal contractors and contract staff. We've got a few who identify themselves as other, which is great. And I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and count down, give you about 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's go ahead and end that poll. And we could share the results folks would like to see. Thanks. Excellent. So before we dive in today, and that's great, we can go ahead and take that off. So before we dive in today, Susan and I would like to introduce ourselves to you so that you have an understanding of the different perspectives that we bring. First, in full disclosure, I need to let you know that I am a recovering Fed. I spent about 25 years in federal service, for which I am still going through therapy, counseling, and coaching to address those issues. But during my federal tenure, I did serve as the Chief of Evaluation for Public Diplomacy at the U.S. Department of State. And during that time, our evaluation efforts were recognized by President George W. Bush, were benchmarked by OMB, GAO, other agencies, and foreign governments. And we were described by our OIG as a best practice. I did transition from state to Treasury and eventually Interior to work as an internal organizational development consultant for federal agencies. And so I have worked with all cabinet level departments and around 130 different agencies. Eventually, I left government to become the executive director of the Performance Institute here in Washington, D.C., where we spent a lot of time working with government managers on government performance, accountability, and transparency. I've also been a senior executive at a couple of other firms, specializing in measuring, monitoring, evaluating, and predicting social and societal impact of funded programs. My current organization I co-founded to provide organizational and performance improvement to organizations and their people in the public, nonprofit, private, and philanthropic sectors. And I'm also still trying to launch my stand-up career, which hasn't gone very far because I tend to tell jokes like this. How does evidence eat its meals? One data byte at a time. So it is my great pleasure, and likely yours, that for me to turn over to my colleague and friend, Susan, to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you very much, Ted, and good afternoon to everyone. I have worked with Ted for quite a number of years now, and we were impressed enough with the work that he was doing that at my agency a few years ago, we hired him to help us with our strategic planning for my particular office. And it was a great experience, and so I'm thrilled to work with him again today. And my name is Susan Jenkins. I'm currently a federal employee. I am the director of the Office of Performance and Evaluation at the Administration for Community Living, which is an operating division of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In 2018 and 19, I served as a senior evidence advisor with the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. I was on a 7-month detail. Previous to that, I was in the Office of Strategic Information, Research and Planning with the U.S. Peace Corps. And before that, I was a federal contractor supporting a range of clients, including the Department of Justice, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the National Institutes of Cancer. And so while I've worked in a lot of different programs with a lot of different substantive areas, really the theme is evaluation, performance measurement, evidence building, methodology, research, those types of things. So I bring that evaluative eye to all of these types of career moves that I've had. And so being trained as a researcher, I gravitate towards numbers and the use of evidence to justify our programs, our policies, and our regulatory decisions. But I've also seen the concrete benefits of program evaluation for programmatic and policy offices. So when you integrate evidence and effectiveness into decision making, you can really make better decisions that are good for both your office, your agency, but also for the citizens, the communities, the organizations that we serve. And so one example that I've seen where having evidence really made a tremendous difference was with the Office of National Drug Control Policy. There was a program that was being investigated to determine what would be a way to reduce the amount of cocaine that was being grown in certain targeted South American countries. And so one idea was to retrain those farmers to growing a new crop, to doing something different. And with the evidence that was gathered before the program was implemented, it was revealed that not only would the farmers necessarily need to be retrained in how to grow a different crop, so there may be different farming techniques, there may be different seasonality, there may be other sort of farming related issues, but it turned out that there were infrastructure issues and transportation issues. So crops that we might think would grow very well in those regions because of the weather, while they might grow well, they weren't being grown by those farmers because those crops were too delicate. And cocaine, as it turns out, is actually quite a hardy crop and can be transported very easily, where bananas, something that may also be good for that region to be able to grow, really couldn't be transported. And these farmers were in very remote situations. So without a crop that could be easily transported to market or to export, a program that would focus on retraining those farmers would have been a failure. And that would have been a waste of federal funds. It would have also had a very detrimental effect on the income of those farmers, the local economies. And so, there are a number of things where evidence really can help us to do more good and to help us to save money, to help our agencies to prosper. And with that said, I know that not everyone believes in data and evidence as much as Ted and I, or maybe are not as comfortable with evidence and data as we are. And so I'm going to turn it back to Ted for a minute to talk about what are some of the factors that hinder the use of evidence.
Right. Thanks, Susan. So, as multiple years as a government evaluator and as a consultant, I've heard a lot of reasons given for why evidence and evaluation aren't utilized, or why they're not pursued. And so let me just give you, some of my favorites that I've heard. I've heard people say, I don't understand data. I don't understand all the calculations, or we don't have the right data, or I don't trust the data. And these really reflect issues of data literacy in organizations and in government leaders. I've also heard, we don't have the time to get the data or collect it, obtain it. We need to make decisions quickly, or I'm experienced and my gut tells me what I need to know. And this points to a real lack of data-informed decision making. I've heard the results happen in the long term, so you can't measure them, or you can't quantify the outcomes of what we do. This is just another management fad that will die off, or as good public servants, we can outlast. Or we can't survey our beneficiaries, the Paperwork Reduction Act, or we're too busy, they're too busy, it's too much burden, it's too sensitive. Oh, we can't ask questions like that. An evaluation won't tell us anything we don't already know. We're on top of everything. We know what's going on. Or measurement isn't something that leaders have to worry about because it's handled by someone else in the organization, kind of that office that nobody talks to down the hall. Or evaluation may produce negative results that will make our program look bad or lose funding. And my absolute favorite, we're unique. We're different. None of all these techniques and methodologies are going to apply to what we're doing. Susan, what kind of reasons have you heard?
Oh, I've definitely heard all of those reasons. And looking at a report from the Government Accountability Office from 2013, there was a survey of federal managers asking why they didn't use evidence or evaluation results in their program decision-making. And the top reason was a lack of resources. And Ted and I maintain and want to help you to understand and to make the case for you that investing in program evaluation and evidence building is worth the time. It is, because ultimately it saves agencies money so that we're not going down the wrong road. We're not providing a service that is not as good as it could be, providing it in the wrong way, providing it in the wrong communities at the wrong time, or in the case of the retraining farmers, we're not offering good farming techniques without the infrastructure build that's necessary for that to be successful. So another example from an evaluation that I was involved in was an evaluation of a program designed to help transition people from prison back into the community. And it provided peer support, drug counseling, educational services, job readiness, and job matching. And a key aspect of the program, the theory behind the program, that gut feeling that we know what's what that Ted mentioned, was that it was supposed to focus on people returning from prison rather than jail, because the theory was people who are in prison generally have longer sentences. It's been a more serious crime that's been committed, and they're in prison for a longer period of time. And that longer period of time may cause them to reevaluate things and really be ready to make that positive change in their life that will allow them to stay in the community, not recidivate, not go back to jail or go back to prison. And so the theory was very sound. But in the evaluation work that we did, we found out that the way the program was being implemented was not really matching the theory the way that it should have. In fact, most of the people that were in the program, and this was due to rushing and trying to get enrollment up as quickly as possible, were actually returning from jail, which is the opposite of what the theory said would really be workable for this program to be successful. And so we found that out. The other thing that we found out from the evaluation is that the staffing was actually very inefficient. And so the peer counselors, who were people who themselves had returned from prison stays, who were counseling the newly returned individuals, were doing a lot of the administrative work. And so they weren't spending their time doing what they were best suited to do. They were doing administrative work, and some of the specialized staff that were supposed to work on fundraising and marketing were also doing whatever needed to be done. The program was really scrambling to get off the ground. And so those people were also inefficiently not using their skills in the best way possible. And so with this evaluation work, we were able to recommend changes to the program before the funding ran out, so that ultimately at the end of the funding period, there could be results that showed that the program did work. And so that was really a good thing that we found from the evaluation, and finding that early, looking into it, and really digging deep saved the federal government money and saved that particular organization a lot of money.
Great. And I would add that, from a pocketbook perspective of a leader, evaluation can actually help you maintain or even increase funds. One of the situations that I happen to be involved in is the bureau that I was serving in. Actually, prior to state, we were with an agency that was dismantled. Our agency or our bureau, excuse me, was moved over to the State Department. And we were at that time the only bureau in the entire department that had an evaluation function. And this was during a time of very austere budget situations. And we were one of 3 out of 30 odd bureaus that actually had a significant increase in our funds. I'm not going to say it was solely due to evaluation, but the fact that we had the ability to demonstrate what worked, why it worked, and how well it was working made for a very strong argument as we were basically competing for funds.
Mm-hmm. And I would second that, Ted, in that I've seen that happen. And it's almost always better, and most of us have probably seen examples of this, where when funders come to ask you a question, GAO comes to ask you a question, the IG comes to ask you a question, Congress comes to ask you a question about your program, particularly during the budget cycle, but other times as well, and you don't have information, they start looking to the next program. Why should we fund you? You don't know what your program is doing. You don't have evidence at the tips of your fingers, that kind of thing. And we really do need to plan for this, so that when those questions come, and we can't always predict exactly what the question will be, but we know generally the types of questions that we would be getting. We have data that we can provide to really show the value of our programs. And so, yeah, it can save us money, but also it can help us to keep money, and it can help us to grow, as Ted was saying. And so to make our case and to help you love evidence building as much as we do, we're going to talk a little bit about the role of evidence more specifically in program development, management, and sunsetting. Ted?
Great, thanks, Susan. So, before we jump in, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, because there are a lot of terms that get thrown around that unfortunately are used interchangeably, but actually do have distinct differences. And so just wanted to make sure that we understand the differences between them. So when we hear the term data, what that refers to is the very specific fact or variable. So often data can be described as characters or text or words or numbers, statistics, percentages, pictures, video, sound bites or audio that we use to capture a characteristic or something that we're interested in looking at. Information then is when we take data and we process it and organize it to be meaningful to us. So what we're doing there is applying a context to what does this set of data mean? What are we learning from it? What is the story that we're telling? And then evidence, and you're going to hear a couple of definitions of this, but in this context, evidence then is the relevant data that supports a particular conclusion that we're trying to reach, or a decision that we're trying to make. And so when we talk about evidence-based policymaking, we're talking about, just as Susan has said, what is that set of data or information that shows what we're trying to achieve? And so we really specify, does that data and information actually answer the question that we've asked or the hypothesis that we have? Oh, I want to share a little story with you to help kind of describe how we see this. So if you're all familiar with the story of Alice in Wonderland, Alice meets the Cheshire Cat and she asks, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The cat says, "That depends a good deal on where you're trying to get to." "Well, I don't care where," said Alice. "Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Okay, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." And so let me just ask you for a moment, what does that encounter mean to you? How do you interpret that? And if you want to put an answer into the chat, that would be great. But what I see from this interaction between Alice and the cat is that we all have questions. In this case, there's a question about the direction we're trying to go. Where are we going? And the cat responds by asking Alice, what is her vision? What is her desired future destination? And so without one, it doesn't really matter what your activities are, because she'll arrive somewhere, but it may not be where she intends, and does she even care about it? So however, if she or if we care, we need to know where to go, what the best path to get there is, whether we're on track and whether or not we've arrived. And that is why where we use evidence. Data with applied context helps us understand where we should go. The evidence helps us to determine what is the most promising path and allows us to monitor if we're on the right course, or if we need to make alterations or improve on what we're doing. Evidence allows us to understand when and where and how we've arrived. So in programmatic terms, data, information, and evidence help us to define our program approach, track our program progress, and assess how successful we are achieving our original intent. Let me turn back to Susan here.
Okay. And so we also want to continue to make the point that we ultimately want to get to knowledge and information that we can use. And so how does data science fit into this? Data science and data scientists are not topics that we immediately come to mind for many of us, but several federal agencies are pushing for new Office of Personnel Management position descriptions and looking for ways to use existing hiring authorities in order to bring on data scientists. Why do we need data scientists? We have statisticians, don't we? We have the nerds in the corner office that nobody talks to that Ted already told us about. So if we go find them, aren't they enough? Well, we need data scientists in large part because they are the bridge between the left half of the visual and the right half of the visual. Data without context is largely useless. While we do need to select appropriate analysis frameworks and structure the data properly, of course, if we do not also have the staff that understand what those data mean and how to turn those data into useful information for problem solving and creating new knowledge, all we have is what we call in my office a wild box of data, which you never want to open because the data fly out at you and you don't know what's going to happen next. And so a few years ago, by way of an example, my office was creating a new data presentation website. And we had a contractor who understood statistics and understood website development, but they really weren't data scientists. And they didn't know how to create a website that presented the data in ways that had practical utility. They could create a beautiful chart, but the charts didn't actually tell us anything that we needed to know. They developed a number of charts for us to look at, which compared unrelated data points. And so the points, for example, that they gave us were the number of people that received the congregate meals. So those are meals served at senior centers or other congregate sites by the region of the country, which might seem interesting to people, but it wasn't what we needed to know for program oversight. Geography and population density are things that we don't have control over. And these are formula grants. So we don't really need to know how many people are receiving the meals in the different geographic areas. This also created a false sense of competition between the geographic areas, which was not helpful either. And so better comparison would have been looking at the number of people that received the meal versus the number of people that were eligible to receive the meals. What percentage of the eligible population were we serving? That was something that we could use with program oversight to improve the program, recruitment, things like that. And if the contractor had understood that, then we would have had better results. Ultimately, the contractor neglected to want to learn more about our data or our programs. They were sticking with straight statistics and computer development, website development. So ultimately, we had to cancel that contract and move on to somebody that really had that data science part of it, that bridge. And so you may also ask why we need to turn data into knowledge. Ted has given a number of examples, but in addition to being responsible as responsible program development, we also are required to do it. And many people think about sort of this modern time frame of evaluation, performance measurement, and evidence building, starting with the Government Results and Performance Act of 1993, or GIPRA as many people call it. And the overarching goal of this act was to improve program management throughout the federal government. And agencies are required to develop strategic plans outlining their missions, long-term goals for agencies' major functions, performance measures, and to report results. That was followed in 2002 with the Program Assessment Rating Tool, also called the PART. For those of us that have been around for a while, we may remember that. And the purpose of that was also generally similar, with assessing and improving program performance so that federal government could achieve better results and we would know what results we were achieving. We would know where we were ending up. And in 2010 came the Government Results and Performance Modernization Act, also sometimes known as GIPRAMA, which based on its name you can figure out, has the same general purpose. And large sections of our agency budget requests and information that we are required to report to Congress are based on the GIPRA Modernization Act. So not only is it the right thing to do for our program development and for our budgeting purposes, we're required to do this. And on the next slide are some of the more modern requirements that we have. So some additional legislative requirements that you should be aware of are the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which was passed in 2018 and emphasizes collaboration and coordination to advance data and evidence building functions of the federal government by statutorily mandating federal evidence building activities, open government data, and confidential information protection and statistical efficiency. So there are a number of things that we have, new requirements that we have related to the Evidence Act, as many people call it. Another is the Federal Data Strategy, which has the stated mission of fully leveraging the value of federal data for mission, service, and the public good by guiding the federal government in practicing ethical governance, data governance, conscious design, and a learning culture. So building a culture of evidence and of learning is very important. The presidential memorandum, Restoring Trust in Government Through Scientific Integrity and Evidence-Based Policymaking, states that it is the current administration's policy to make evidence-based decisions guided by the best available science and data, and it reinforces previous memoranda from 2009 and 2010. And the last one here is the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And this requires agencies to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. And this last one doesn't have data or evidence in its title, so it may seem a little out of place on this list. But in order to know if we're making a change, if we are improving equity and reducing inequality, we need data about the current conditions, about what it is that we're doing, and then the conditions as a result of new programs, improved programs, expanded programs, policy, or regulation. And so a couple of examples of why this is important from my own evaluation career. One was a study of supplying hygiene items to juvenile detainees. So these are juveniles that were in secure detention through the local departments of justice. And the idea of the hygiene supplies was they could better present themselves in court, because there are studies that show that people with a neater appearance have more positive court outcomes. But the hair supplies were not suitable for textured hair, so they weren't suitable for African Americans. So this program actually increased racial disparity in court outcomes, because without looking at the program and the data through an equity lens, it could look like, since hygiene was theoretically equalized, everyone had the same opportunity for a neater appearance, but some people were choosing not to take that up. That wasn't actually the case. The supplies that were offered to them were not appropriate to them. And people would think that the outcomes were actually related to the court outcomes and not to this hygiene finding. So in this case, the evaluation uncovered inequities in how the program was actually conceived and operated. Another example is related to policy, because not all of us oversee programs. Some of us oversee policy or regulation or focus more in those areas. And while there's a policy that we have related to the use of evidence-based programs, certain funds that we have to be used for evidence-based programs, which are programs that have been shown through rigorous evaluation to have certain positive outcomes for individuals, families, communities, and organizations. And so while positive on its face, because we're spending money on things that have been proven to work, there are a few problems inherent in this policy. The evidence base, who we have developed the evidence of efficacy with, is not equitable and favors members of the majority culture. So we don't know what benefit or potential harm there may be to other populations, because we haven't tested these programs with other populations. The policy prioritizes the use of evidence-based programs over the realities that there are inequities inherent in the available pool of programs that meet the evidence-based requirement. As a practical issue, many of the programs require regular in-person attendance at sessions, which can significantly disadvantage people who may have transportation needs or childcare needs, people with disabilities if the locations are not accessible to them. And many of the programs have not been translated culturally or linguistically, so disadvantage members of language minority groups or members of ethnic and other minority groups. So many of the programs really, while they look like they're good and they do work for certain populations and have been shown to work for those populations, having a policy that requires the use of evidence-based program can actually be detrimental. You can imagine a case where a program that doesn't have the evidence base yet, but has been working well and at least is promising, may not be able to be funded anymore under this policy. So without looking with an equity lens, we really may not know what our policies are doing and that they may be causing more harm than good, particularly if we replace what appear to be promising programs with evidence-based programs that don't work for those populations. So now those populations don't come to the program anymore, or the organizations that were offering the programs who see that these programs are not well suited to their context are no longer offering those programs and no longer have access to the funds that are tied to the evidence-based programs. So Ted, I'll turn it back over to you to talk a little bit more about our general themes.
Sure. Well, before I jump into that, so, I think it's really easy probably for an audience listening to us to say, well, of course you guys love it. You're evaluators, you're data geeks, you love this stuff. But I'm managing policies and programs and operations and all kinds of things. And why should I really care about this? And I think one of the things that, Susan and I both as professors and as federal employees encounter is that the reason most of us joined government was because we want to make a difference. There's something important. We want to create a world or an environment or, a situation that is better than maybe how we found it. And so we want to know, are we having an impact? And one of my favorite cartoons is the one that's on the screen now. And, in my experience, I tend to find there's a lot of programs, a lot of government public sector programs that are kind of like howling wolves. There's some distant goal. And as we're looking at that goal, there's a lot of activity, or quite frankly, a lot of noise, trying to get at that goal. And, even sometimes we feel like we're on the edge of a precipice. But there has to be that person who's asking the question, are we making an impact? Are we doing something that makes a difference in the world? And that's where the use of evidence and evaluation and equity can enhance all that we're doing.
And Ted, if I can jump in for just a second, to be honest, we're also fighting over dollars. So it's not all unicorns and roses. There are only so many dollars. And if one program gets funded, one policy gets funded, and one regulation gets the support, another one doesn't. And so we are fighting for those dollars. And so having that evidence that if we receive those dollars, we will spend them for this amount of good really can help us in that sort of competitive arena as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, we want to ask ourselves, okay, so how do we understand if we are making a difference? Or how do we understand how do we best allocate the resources that we do have? And the simple answer, I think, here is evidence and program evaluation and equity. A lot of us, because of, as Susan mentioned earlier, GIPRA and all the follow-on responses to that, the president's management agenda, and a number of other things really drove this idea of a results-oriented thinking. And of course, we're still implementing performance measurement as a way to kind of answer the questions. However, performance measurement and program evaluation are two different tools. And I like to use the analogy that, because I have heard from people saying that, well, I don't have to do any kind of evaluation work because we have performance measures. And we've seen this in federal agencies. The performance measurement office is not part of the evaluation office, or they're very separate functions and sometimes don't talk, which also doesn't help us getting our performance information together to really, again, make data-informed decisions. And so I liken performance measurement and program evaluation kind of with this analogy. Performance measurement is like a compass. It's a tool that you use to understand, are we heading in the right direction? So if you've set north as the direction you want to go, you would use your compass to determine, am I going north? Or do I need to make an adjustment? That's really what performance measurement is about. It's that flag to understand, are we progressing the way that we intended, or are we getting signals that we need to make a change to get back on track? Evaluation, on the other hand, then is more like a map. It's that picture of your environment and the terrain that you're in. And what you can use a map for is to find out where we've been. You can identify your location, and then what's around you. What is the best path forward? What might be ahead of you that could be an obstacle? Do you have a big river, mountain that you have to go around? And then what are the best paths? What are the best alternatives for getting there? Now, the primary purpose of evaluation is not gotcha. It is to contribute to the improvement of policies and programs by answering the questions that we have about our direction and our activities. Or in other terms, about our outcomes, our outputs, our processes, and our resources, as well as the effects of our environment on the extent of our success. And so evaluation generates important information for use in continuous improvement, and it documents the knowledge and benefits that are often unaccounted for when we are communicating our program's value to stakeholders. Evaluation answers questions like, does the program work? To what extent have we achieved our objectives? Are there any alternatives that might be better? Or how are our beneficiaries experiencing the program? And that can help us determine whether to continue, to expand, to adjust, to end, or to start something new. But evaluation also has other benefits. Evaluation can be used to answer internal and external questions. If we want to increase employee engagement, we need evidence from evaluations to understand where to focus our improvement efforts. Or if we want to increase citizen engagement and satisfaction, evaluation provides a structured and systematic way that we can hear directly from our constituencies, identify unanticipated results, both good and bad. The multiplier effect of, because our folks have succeeded, how does that change their environment? Or, are there things that we didn't consider, as Susan has described in some of her examples? And it documents what those needs are. So it's a really solid way to keep our programs accountable. So evaluation is critical then for all functions of an organization to succeed. And so what we'd like to do here is conduct another audience poll. And this one is related to your primary job function. So if we could get that second poll up. And again, this helps us so we can kind of address some of these issues in particular. Great, we're seeing great participation, excellent. Oh, so we have folks from a variety of areas. Looks like the biggest majority, well, I won't say it's majority, but the largest section right now, program development and implementation and oversight. We also have a few fellow evaluation nerds with us. Glad you're here. Yeah, thumbs up to that. All right, so I'm going to give you, oh, good. We've 100% of you have ordered or voted, excuse me. So let's go ahead and end the poll. And just to show you where the breakout. So we have folks in a variety of areas. Excellent, thank you. Susan.
So to talk a bit more about why everyone should care about evaluation, no matter what your particular role in your agency is or what your particular focus for your position might be, not only is it something we're required to do based on the legislation that we talked about a few minutes ago, but some of that legislation specifically calls in other parts of our agency, not just the evidence building, performance measurement, evaluation staff, but it really calls in other people. So the Evidence Act of 2018 requires that all Chief Financial Officer Act agencies, CFO Act agencies, and it encourages other agencies or large components of the CFO Act agencies to have 3 named positions. So this brings in HR staff to make sure that each of those agencies has an evaluation officer, a chief data officer, and a statistical official. And the Act also has very specific requirements for what that person, what those 3 people need to do, need to have, what kind of experience they need to have. And so HR staff always need to be concerned with new positions. And with the new focus on data science and potentially new position descriptions related to data science, that's another area that HR staff should be aware of and thinking about, well, how can we hire data scientists? What are the requirements that there may be around that? So there are a number of HR related things going on. Budget staff, people that work on the budget justifications, always need to be aware of these new requirements. As part of the budget justification that goes to OMB and Congress each year, they require these things. So looking at circular A11, so those of you budget folks will know A11, which is called the preparation, submission, and execution of the budget. There are specific requirements related to equity, evidence, and performance measures. And for the true nerds, such as myself, and I'll throw Ted in there also, Section 290 of A11 is specifically titled Evaluation and Evidence Building Activities and goes into quite a lot of detail related to the evidence reporting requirements. Program officers and IT staff need to be aware of these new guidelines and requirements because program staff need to ensure that data about programs is collected and that programs are developed with a clear vision, that the Cheshire Cat has helped us to know where we want to go, and that such data are going to be collected so that we know where we're going, we know what we're doing, and we start collecting those data at the beginning of a program. Or if we inherit a program that's already underway, that we make sure that we start collecting those data and using those data along the way. And IT staff need to be aware because data collection systems typically are web-based. And so there needs to be collaboration between the program staff, the evaluation staff, performance staff, and the IT staff to develop tools that really can collect, compile, and report out on those data. And program officers and line staff also need to be involved as expertise is central in a lot of different areas. And we've likely all been in situations where a shiny new program or policy is introduced and we think, oh, here we go again, because it's already been tried and it's failed. And without a new explanation for why that policy or regulation or procedure is going to work, we just sort of wait it out and we wait for the failure, for the second failure to come. And so program staff and line staff typically know where those weak points are, where those pain points are, and should be involved in the development of the evidence around those programs that is used to develop new programs, policies, and regulations, measure the effect of those programs, policies, and regulations, and then make recommendations about continuing, expanding, or sunsetting those programs, policies, or regulations. And policy staff need to be aware because, like the example that I gave of the evidence-based policy, we need to think through the intended and unintended consequences of our policies on all of the stakeholders who might be involved. And so we need policy staff to be involved to think about what are the potential outcomes of this policy, the so what, and how can we measure that? And how will we know if the policy or the regulation is a success? And so we need to support information that really is helpful to everybody. And an example that we have right now of a policy that's having an effect that we're not really sure about is in my particular agency, we have a program for caregivers. And so some of the caregivers are caregivers of older adults, and some of the caregivers are older adult caregivers of younger family members, so grandchildren typically. And so the policy that we have is that most of the money is spent on the caregivers of older adults. So we're looking into doing an evaluation of what is the impact of that policy of focusing on the caregivers of older adults as opposed to focusing on the older adult caregivers of younger family members. Are we meeting the needs of these caregivers? Are we causing an inequity amongst these caregivers, amongst the programs? Because where more money is put, more services happen. And there's more recruitment, there's more involvement, more attention to those programs. And so at this moment, we don't know if this is good or bad, but it's something that we need to look into to see how is this policy affecting the people that we are intending to serve. And are we meeting the needs of the field? Are we meeting the needs of the individuals? And so we don't know that implication because we haven't evaluated it. So policy staff and program staff have a huge stake in the type of evidence that we collect. Ted, do you have other things to add?
Oh, I think, you know, probably most of you have heard the term data-driven decision-making, and I much prefer the term data-informed decision-making, but that's a different talk. But the key kind of information is, or the key point is that data and information and evidence really are fundamental in decision-making processes. One of the things that I experienced, I was recently presenting an online course for federal executives on data-informed decision-making, and the single most important or frequent feedback I received from over 400 senior managers in SES was that there wasn't a commitment in the organization to improve data understanding and use. The focus was on collecting and reporting and the IT system. And so we spend all these resources to collect and report, but really, is the data being used? And is the data being explored for the stories that it tells us? So are data shared and discussed throughout and across the organization? Are we experimenting with different programmatic approaches to drive innovation, or testing alternatives to find out which work better? And to add to Susan's examples, just a couple that I've been involved with where evidence and evaluation made critical differences or unearthed unanticipated findings. I was working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on a program where they were testing out and trying to develop statewide plans for children's disaster reunification. So after either a natural or man-made disaster, how do you reunite children with their legal guardians, and what kind of processes and things are needed? And they experimented in 2 states. And the assumption going in was this was always going to be a state-driven approach. Well, what they found is that in one state that worked. That's how that particular state operates. It is a top-down thing. In another state, it almost failed miserably, because what they didn't understand was that that particular state is local community based, and it actually is much more of a bottom-up kind of state where what gets taken care of actually happens at a very, very local level. And so they had to adjust the process in order to allow for kind of this approach. And so eventually both states ended up developing successful plans. I had another one in which I thought it was one of the most interesting findings was we were looking at how an agency, a federal agency, responded to foreign, basically correspondence and requests, and they were almost behind years and years, in getting responses. And what we found was that because it was one of the scientific agencies, there were a couple of different functions that had to review any responses. One of those functions is located, I'll just say, in the Washington, D.C. area, and another of the locations that has to review their response is located in North Carolina. And one of the things that was found in the evaluation was that in situations in which the people in North Carolina and the people in the Washington, D.C. area don't know each other, have not met, or don't speak often, those had a significantly slower response rate than where people actually knew each other and moved. Now, that might be something that's kind of obvious when you hear it, but that was something that was uncovered. And by uncovering that, the agency then implemented an improved networking communication system. And I don't mean an IT system, but really building trust between the two functions and those two bureaus. So I think that's kind of it. And one of the things that we want to ensure is, we're throwing a lot of terms out there. We want to just make sure that people have a good understanding of what those are. So let me turn it back to Susan.
Mm-hmm. And we are close to the top of the hour, so I won't go into detail on these next two slides, but these are here for your reference in terms of some definitions of what evidence is. So we have program evaluation and performance measurement, foundational fact finding and policy analysis defined here. And the source is an OMB memorandum that came out as part of the guidance for the Evidence Act. And on the next slide, we have another way of looking at what do we mean about the categories of evidence. And so really we want as many different types of evidence as possible. So as Ted mentioned, performance measurement, performance management tells us one type of information. It gives us one view of things. Evaluation tells us some additional or broader things, the how and the why. And statistical and data analysis can also give us a different picture. So we really want all three of those things at the same time. And on the next slide, we have our next poll. So if we could bring up the poll. Which of the following are barriers to your development or use of evidence evaluation or performance measurement? And you can select all that apply on this one. So we're getting some good results. Mm-hmm. Oh, a few people are saying none. Evidence is my thing. So I love it. We almost didn't put that response category in there. So I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
And then we're seeing many of the other items, and we'll leave it up for about 5 more seconds. It's too expensive. We should use the resources for programming. It will be too much of a burden. We don't have the staff expertise, fear of negative results. Those are always things that we see. So if we can close the poll and share the results with folks, don't have the staff experience, the staff or the staff expertise. And that is very common. And so working with that office in the corner that nobody likes, that is one way to do it. And we will talk a little bit about other barriers, I think, or maybe Ted, do you want to just jump to the tips that we have for addressing these types of barriers?
Sure. So, we have this, there are pitfalls to avoid, and we can discuss these in questions. But basically, one of the things is, as we've kind of talked about, is you need to be able to know what kind of data are you focused on? Are you using the right kind of measures? Data quality is always an issue. Having evaluation as an afterthought, as opposed to planning it when you're planning new programs. Not using the data, not, taking the time to actually plan how you're going to measure success. And a number of these other things. But the tips that we've found, I think, are really the I think takeaways that we want to focus on for you. And first one is, whenever you're thinking about your performance and the evidence and the evaluations, the equities, you always want to start by asking 2 questions. The first one, what do we want to know? What questions do we have about our organization, about our program, about a particular situation? And then the second is that once we receive that information, what actions do we want to take? What decisions do we want to make? That's going to structure how we approach our performance measurement evaluation and building our evidence base. We also want to invest in organizational data literacy. Data literacy, and I saw this in some of the questions, that are popping up in the chat about how do you distinguish this? How do you talk to people about it? The thing that's really important to understand is that data literacy is like a foreign language. I was terrible at foreign languages. And it wasn't until I immersed myself by going to that country. And within a week period, 1 week, 2 week period, I started dreaming in that language. My teacher told me, oh my gosh, you are so improved in this. Now, does that mean that you all have to go out and become data scientists? Well, yeah, that would be our goal. But you want to be data literate. You want to know how to understand and speak and write about data so that you make it part of your culture, so that everyone has a stake in the data. You want to use a framework that shows what your causal linkages are between what your activities, your deliverables or outputs and outcomes are. And usually that's done through a theory of change or logic models. There are other tools out there. When you're looking at evidence and you're bringing things back in, you have to eliminate, especially in performance management, eliminate blame and shame as your approach. What you want to focus on is organizational learning. If any performance measurement system is about calling somebody on the carpet and seeing heads roll and trying to find out who can we blame, it will fail. And we have to actively engage our stakeholders so that we know, actually, number one, what do they want to know? What actions do they want to take? So that when we're investing in building evidence, having evaluations, that they will be engaged as well.
Mm-hmm.
Susan.
Yeah, and so a couple of things that I'll add that reflect some of the questions that we've gotten is really sort of, as Ted was saying, it's a foreign language. And so you don't necessarily, everyone doesn't have to be fluent, but you do need to know how to ask, where's the bathroom, and how to call for help. You need to know enough of the language to be able to do those couple of things. And you have to know who to ask. That's the other thing. Everyone doesn't need to be an evaluator or a data scientist, but you have to know when you need one, and you have to know who to ask. And so hiring data scientists and hiring staff to the extent that you can, or training some of your staff in some of these areas can be very helpful, at least to have the basic familiarity to know when you need an expert. Stakeholder engagement, as Ted said, asking people what they want to know, not blaming people. Something that we do in my agency, when we do an evaluation, we work with the program office or the policy office, and we start off by saying, you think your program is really good. We are sure that your program is really good. You believe this for a reason. You're an expert. We will find the good in your program. We may find other things, and we have an evaluation policy to make sure that we put forward all of the results, the good and the bad, but we will look until we find the good that you know is in your program. We also allow stakeholders to write a foreword to our evaluation reports. They can't change the data or the methodology or the rigor, but they can write a contextualizing foreword. And that makes people feel a lot more engaged and comfortable with the evaluation and transparency. There's a lot of conversation. Building a data culture really is one of the biggest tips, I think, that we have. Get everybody interested in data to the extent that they can. Do small data projects to show people the value of data to their programs. Highlight people that are using data in new and innovative ways, or have asked really poignant data-related questions so that other people can say, oh, wait, I could ask a question like that. I could do this type of thing, so that people can see themselves in the data, if you will. And so there are ways to flexibly fund evaluation and research and program measurement, performance measurement programs, things like that. And there are a lot of toolkits that can be adapted to your specific agency that use examples from your agency. So again, people can see themselves in the data. Next slide.
Yep.
And so we're going to wrap up and then have time for questions, more questions. But Ted, do you want to talk about this one?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
It's on you.
And so one way to help people to see themselves in the data and to really be part of it is we all have evaluative thinking. We all make evaluation choices. While there is expertise needed with specific methodologies, rigor, statistical analyses, things like that, we all make choices. Which route are we going to take to get to work? What are we going to eat for dinner? What are we going to wear today? What school are we going to send our children to? You know, whatever it might be. That same type of thinking is the underlying framework for evaluation. So we can all contribute to evaluation and performance measurement. Next slide. And this is a quote that we use in my office a lot. People change what they do less because they're given an analysis that shifts their thinking than because they're shown a truth that influences their feelings. And so I am a data nerd through and through, up and down, inside and out. But I have to talk to program staff, policy staff, grantees, and other stakeholders in the language that makes sense to them. I have to give them the information that's useful, helpful, and interesting to them. My wild box of data is of no use to anybody if no one's interested in the data that's inside of it. So we do have to really understand, what is it that people want? Why are they attached to this program or this policy or this population or solving this problem, so that we can answer those questions. And next slide. Here's something, I like visuals a lot, but the wild box of data, we have all the data up at the top. You can sort it and you know a little bit of something, and it looks like yellow is the most, you know, compared to black and compared to green in this. But then you arrange it and you start to pile it up and organize it a little bit more. You visually present it until you learn more about the data with each of these iterations. But until you get down to the bottom, the so what? Why do we have this information? What are we going to do with it? That's the house at the bottom. That's what we're really looking for with all of this. And that's why we should all care about evaluation, evidence building, equity, inquiry, and performance measurement. Ted?
Yeah, so basically, you know, at the end of this session, at the end of today, and as you think about your legacy as a leader, when it comes to evidence, evaluation, and equity, will you care or will you just comply? So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and we're glad to open this up and have questions and dialogue. So we're happy to either, if you want to put other questions into the chat, we can do that, or also feel free to unmute and we can answer that way. Raise your hand though first. So we'll allow our friends at Key Communications to moderate that.
And so I see one question to get us started about getting other people on board with combating the myths that were listed as barriers. And I think Ted and I have both seen, many of us on the call on this webinar have seen people saying, I can't do it because of whatever reason they have. Something that I've seen to work is, in the nicest way possible, the most polite way possible, asking people to unpack that. Well, what do you mean you can't do it because we don't have the staff? Is it the number of staff? Is the expertise of staff? Could you have somebody come in on a detail? You know, what are some creative ways to get the type of staff that might be helpful? Could you include some of this in one of your contracts? You know, something like that. So those are some ways to get people on board, really asking them to unpack why they think that this thing is a barrier, and then working on bite-sized pieces of that to sort of move people to more acceptance of this. I see a hand up from Kim.
Kim?
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for the presentation. I guess one of my questions is, as we build out this culture of data and learning, do you recommend like a centralized data office, or do you recommend kind of just force multiplying that by having experts in all of the operational service units that can work together. I'm just curious to know philosophically or from a policy standpoint, actually, what works.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. I would answer with you want both.
Yep.
So, data, I'll just say this, we're moving in a direction in which data will become a much more integral part of everybody's daily routine. And you want to be able to have people, and one of the reasons that I think we really emphasize building a data literate culture in an organization is because people come from different experiences, different backgrounds. They will see the data differently, and when you allow more people to look at the data, to think about the data, reflect on it, they might ask different questions that can lead you to getting at, oh wow, we haven't thought about that. So from one perspective, you do want it spread. But also too, there has to be a way that you funnel that data into the strategic direction of an organization. And so that's generally where a centralized kind of approach is, so that you're looking at how are we moving the entire organization. I tend to liken it to, and this is what we did when I was at State. My office was the centralized office. We were looking at the strategic direction and the strategic data. And then each of the program offices worked on their own, what I would call tactical or business data. But our job was to help them and be a resource to help them understand that data, help them align that data, so that we were always being able to kind of feed that up. And Susan, I don't.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think having some centralization, be it a committee that centralizes information so that people can learn from each other and that the data are somewhat standardized, can be one approach to it. But you always need confederates, if you will, if not actual experts that are out in the different operating divisions, components, units, offices, things like that. So yeah, I agree with what Ted said. A little bit of both can be
Thanks.
helpful.
That's kind of the direction we're leaning right now. So it's good to hear that.
Good.
Thanks. Thanks for the answer.
Thank you. I see Erin has a hand up.
Hi, yes, Erin. I work as a contractor with CISA, and I was just curious. I know data literacy has been a big buzzword around our office lately, and I totally believe in its importance, and I'm a huge data nerd. But I was just curious, how would you all define data literacy, and what do you think are some concrete steps, I guess, to evaluating that we've gotten to more of a data literate culture?
So a couple of things. One thing actually that one of my staff was saying to me today, which is an excellent point, and she is absolutely right, I think, is while we do need people to have enough comfort with data and have some basic literacy with data, they don't need to be data experts. They don't need to be completely fluent, if you will, to go back to that analogy. But it's also our job as the people putting out the data to translate the data into their language, into their programmatic or policy language, into plain language, which is a requirement in the federal government. That's one thing, but also telling the story that they want to hear, on the topic. It's not going to have necessarily the outcomes that they want. That really depends on what the data tell us, but really we need to also translate the data to the staff, in addition to having the staff maybe build some of that literacy themselves. Something that we've seen in our office, we have a number of different competitions, and we highlight people that ask data questions, that work with the data, that ask for evaluations and performance measurement support from my office. And to us, that's how we measure data literacy, if you will. It's not technically, a test like in school. Do you know a chi-square? Do you know what an R value is? Not that kind of literacy, but do you know enough about data that when you see something that doesn't look right, or somebody's making a claim that's not supported, you know that that's a problem? Do you know when to ask an expert, that kind of thing? And so we started a new way of contracting. We started an internal IDIQ, indefinite deliverable, indefinite quantity contract, so that different program offices who don't have evaluation staff in their program offices can give money to my office, and then we work with our contractors to support that office. And each year we've gotten more and more money from the different program offices, more and more programs and requests for service. So for us, that's one of our measures of data literacy. And I use the term very loosely. Ted?
I would define, I mean, data literacy is the ability to comprehend and speak data. And so it really is, in very simplistic terms, is if you see a chart and a graph, do you know how to read it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what it's saying? Do you know how to get the information from it? But it's also, it's the entire process. Do you know how to plan for data? Do you know how to obtain that data? How to, and then work with it to know whether you have quality data or not. And as Susan said, and it really boils down to, do you know what the right questions are to ask about the data? So, I work with agencies on developing data literacy, amongst them. And so in terms of looking at how you're moving through kind of a maturity, there is a maturity model that can be used with data literacy. And so one of the things too that I saw with state when I was there was one, the first step was just getting people interested in the data, that there actually was something that you could do. And then how do you start using it? How do you start incorporating it into the decision making? And and again, I would echo kind of a point Susan was making, was what we found was that the more people ended up having access to data, the more sophisticated they became, the more interested they became, and the more sophisticated they became. And then just a quick, Kim, your question on where to access maturity model. There's a number of them out there, but we kind of work with one that is much more behavioral kind of approach. It just gives you ideas of what your organization would look like at various stages. And then, there is a federal data maturity model as well.
Yeah, and if you look for the data strategy and some of those documents, if you Google federal data strategy, you'll get to some web pages that probably will give you what you need. And there is that data playbook. I forgot the exact title of it, but there's a playbook that has a maturity model that might be helpful to you.
Yeah, in fact, I would say probably the federal data strategy has become an excellent resource. And there's actually a relatively new website just launched, which is evaluation.gov. So there are those kind of resources as well.
And for those of you that are federal staff or military, if you have a Max page account, so the federal Max page, there is the evidence team at OMB, and that's where, when I was on detail a couple of years ago, I was with the evidence team. They have a number of Evidence Act resources as well as other resources related to building evidence, recorded webinars and slide decks and other things like that. But you have to have a .gov or .mil email address in order to have a Max account. You can apply for a Max account, and then you can access those resources there as well.
Other questions, or if we didn't get to one of yours that you had asked earlier, you just want to let us know, and happy to go back. I know that there was one about sharing the slides. Yeah, we can arrange that. We'll send it to Key.
Hi, Ted and Susan. As we wait for more questions potentially to come in, again, just feel free to share through the chat or the raise hand feature at the bottom of your participants window. But until then, just a reminder, yes, we will be posting the recording of this session and all related slides, resources onto our website at key.american.edu. Thank you, Erin, for sharing some resources. Again, thank you so much to all for joining us for our FEDTalks session today. We want to share gratitude, of course, with Susan and Ted for their wealth of knowledge, their data nerdiness, and for all such a robust and timely discussion on what federal leaders need to know about using data to make that impact and strengthen the workforce and mission achievement. And just in the spirit of data, while we field questions, just want to drop another poll very last, just for feedback for today's session. We will leave it on throughout, so feel free to reply. We won't share this, it's just for our own internal feedback as well. And yes, we will turn those slides into PDF for y'all. All right.
And so, Erin, I'm not sure if you have your hand up again. If you have another question, feel free to ask.
Yeah.
I do, thanks. If no one else wants to ask.
No, please.
I just wanted to commend you all. I really appreciated the focus on like working for the user and user friendliness when it comes to sharing data and serving people. And I also noticed that I feel like you all did that really well with these slides. I've noticed a huge issue. I come from a military background and now working on the federal side as well, with the concept of like slide humans. Have you ever heard of that? Where like people send out PowerPoint slides basically in lieu of attending an actual physical presentation, and the challenges that that can create when sharing data, because if you're looking at a slide that was intended to be given as a presentation or vice versa, then you have, you know, some communication issues that can happen. And so I felt like your all's presentation was so well done, and I was wondering if you had any tips on just you know, combating the issue of slide humans in the government.
You know, the story that I give is, I'll just say the last department that I worked for, which is why I left government. I worked for somebody who was a couple layers or levels above, who ran the organization by PowerPoint. And what I meant by that is he would go off to conferences, and if there was a presentation he really liked, he'd come back and he'd have us as the senior team sit around the table, and he would give us copies of the presentation and say, everybody turn to like slide 14 and the third bullet. That's our new priority. And, you know, and oftentimes those presentations, you know, if they followed PowerPoint rules, you know, it was a, you know, 5x5 or 7x7. So, you know, you had maybe 5 words, and that was the entire context for the priority. And so we had no idea what to do. One of the things that is really important for you to think through with any of these things is, what is the story that you're trying to tell? And, you know, get to your point. One of the things that I think really hinders a lot of good data is the notion that there's no point to it. It's a lot of data, and you want to think about, in the way that I kind of think about it is, what's the headline? And, you know, what's kind of the accurate headline that's coming from that data that you want to put together and share? What is the story it says? The other thing too is, I think, ask questions. You know, it really is, you know, what does it mean to you? You know, you see this kind of data, what do you see in it? Are there relationships there? Are there things that surprise you in it? But yeah, unfortunately, you know, it's going to be years, I think, before we ever get away from, you know, the PowerPoint leave behind as the main thing, but trying to encourage discussion. And I think too, that was one of the things that we did in evaluation, was always had, if you have questions about this, here's how to contact us, you know, so that we could actually talk through and walk through you know, interpretations with people.
Mm-hmm. And a couple things that we do are to have our data, particularly from our evaluations, we present that information in a lot of different ways. Some people want a 5-minute video that hits on 1 or 2 points. Some people want what we call data one pointers, where there's a single point that we're trying to make. We have a graphic, some sort of chart or data visual, as well as a couple of sentences that explain the data source and the point that we're trying to make, because some people don't like visuals. My supervisor, for example, does not like visuals. So we always have to have the little short paragraph or bullet that goes along with it. And we have those one pointers. We have short videos. We have PowerPoint slide decks. We have presentations. We have webinars. We have a range of different things that we have, issue briefs that might be 2 pages or 10 pages, you know, depending on the particular topic. And so presenting the data in a lot of different ways. And something that we've done to go back to the data culture idea of it is we got a couple of those huge screens in our office right before we all got sent home. And so those big giant television screens, and we didn't have any content for them. For some reason, and I'm telling a tale now, I think we had extra money at the end of the fiscal year. I don't know for sure, but that's my impression. And so we bought this giant television screen so that when you came into our offices for our operating division, you saw this giant screen, and we didn't have content for it. So, love to fill a vacuum. My office, we came up with one pointers, if you will, that we could put on that screen so that every day, visitors, people that worked in our office, people in our agency, they saw data. And we work with our program staff. What is one point that you want people to know about your program? What is one finding that you think is most interesting? And we develop those into one pointers and put them up on the screen, because I think something that many of us do, if we're the data nerds, we have 1,000 things we can say. No one wants to hear 1,000 things. People want to hear 1 or 2 things. And so we really do have to pull ourselves back. And you can have the big report, you can have the lengthy volumes, but you have to have these shorter documents, these more interactive documents where people can click on links and they can move to things and they can see things moving around with animation. And some of those are some of the things that we can do to put our data forward, make it more of an everyday type of thing, make it more palatable to folks so that they do build that data culture and people are more data literate. Because as Ted said, you have to immerse yourself in data. You have to, it has to be around you. You have to get comfortable with it as a first step.
I think, Kim, you know, to answer your question on hiring, I think, you know, it's going to depend on the kind of level that you're looking at. There are, you know, several schools, universities that have good data programs that you could probably pull people from. Of course, most data scientists are in the private sector, and especially with tech companies. But you know, you also want someone who understands the work that you do. And I think one of the critical things about thinking about a data scientist is they need to understand what your business, you know, for lack of a better term, what your business is, and what's important to you. And again, I think in Susan gave the example in the presentation. I mean, if you have a data scientist who's all about the data, and I ran into this when I started my work in evaluation. I actually started and went into evaluation because I had, as a program manager, had been on the receiving end of a very poorly done evaluation. And so my approach had always been, you know, again, it's a service, it's a resource, it's to help you understand what's happening. And so you want somebody who is going to be able to know and think through how does, you know, they're looking at the data contribute to your strategy as an organization.
Mm-hmm. And just very quickly, in terms of hiring, I've been involved in some of these conversations around the new OPM position descriptions and things like that. And so some new reports are coming out about this and new hire using existing hiring authorities and things like that, but getting people young. So if you try to pull people from mid-career in the private sector, we honestly likely can't afford them. So if you can get people through the Presidential Management Fellowship type of program, some of those types of things. Interns from universities, so Ted was mentioning universities, get people on the federal path early and have them see the satisfaction that is possible, you know, in federal service and that kind of thing. That's something absolutely to try to work towards. And so I've heard a number of people talk about that.
Yeah, in terms of Aaron, your point on schools, I can't recommend any particular ones. The two that just, without kind of going back and looking at them, the two popped into my mind that relate to public service or kind of nonprofit, Northwestern, and then many of the Boston schools. There's a lot of data people up there in Boston. The other thing to look at too is to try to recruit out of the big firms, the McKinseys and Bain and those kind of things. There are folks there, but as Susan said, they might not be. If you get them at a more junior level, we might be able to afford them in government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it looks like our time is up. So we want to thank you very much for joining us, for sticking with us, for the questions, for participating in the polls. And we hope that this was useful to you.
And, for any of you, feel free, if you have questions later on, to reach out to us. I'm put my email in. Happy to speak to anybody afterwards, and I'm sure Susan is as well.
Yes, and we're also on the website for the KEY program, so you can always find our information there too, but I'm putting in my email real quick.
Thank you both so much, Ted and Susan. It's always such a pleasure listening to you and being in the presence of your shared knowledge. I always learn something every time, and I'm really glad that we're able to provide this for our community today. And for everyone who's still online, just a reminder that we will send out an email with a recording of today's session, in addition to a way to access the PowerPoint presentation and connect with Ted and Susan. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy this beautiful weather, and we look forward to seeing you at future KEY events. Take good care.